This is a production of Cornell University.
Hey, so this is Sam Zacher, and welcome to Book Sandwiched In. I'm deathly ill and leaving early, for which I apologize. But as you know, this has been just a fabulous year in Book Sandwiched In. We've had lots of really interesting speakers come through, and Sam's going to give us something that is a combination of some of her story and a talk about Anglo-Saxon Jewish heroes.
Yeah, that's about right.
Welcome.
Yeah, thanks. Is it traditional to meet everybody, or should? Okay, let me just ask: who has taken some medieval studies courses? Yes, for sure.
2010 counts.
Okay. A little bit, yeah. Okay, the survey course, yeah. Okay. All right. I was just curious to know, starting out, if I had any kindred spirits in the group. But who knows? Maybe you'll be converts at some point. I want to pass around a handout, and I'll get to it, in a bit. And what I wanted to do was start with a kind of personal story, just about how I became a medievalist and what interested me. And I think my story is a little less traditional in the sense that a lot of people I know who are medievalists get started with a real fanatical love of Tolkien or Arthurian stories. That they get into it through a particular love of medieval literature. And unfortunately, that's not my story. We were just talking about balloting when it comes to housing around here. And so my story actually begins with a ballot. I was an undergraduate at Vassar College, and they had a balloting system for choosing classes. And I was, as a freshman, at the bottom of the barrel, and then I also drew one of the lowest numbers in the entire college. And so I ended up taking a course on medieval literature with this professor named Ken Whedon, who was beloved by many students and feared by others. And I was a little bit nervous about taking the class, having had no background whatsoever. But I took it, and I enrolled, and I got into class, and I was totally blown away by the literature. We started reading Chaucer. In fact, it wasn't just medieval. It went from Chaucer up to about the 18th century. But what really, really got me was Chaucer and Spenser. Spenser being a little bit outside of medieval, as you guys may know. But I really, really loved it. And he had a very interesting policy. He was a new critic, fundamentally, religiously, orthodoxly. And so he would demand that we would know how to look at meter when it came to poetry, how to scan things, and in particular etymologies. That was his big thing. So we were expected to come to class having looked up the majority of the important words in a poem or in a text that we were reading. And one day, this is one of my most memorable lessons, we came to class and nobody had looked up the word monster. And I hadn't had Latin by that time, so I wasn't sure, and nobody volunteered an etymology for monster, and he just dismissed the class. Go home and don't return. And
You always dream of doing that.
Yes. And it was an amazing experience. I learned so much from that. So the first thing I did was I marched back to the library and I started looking up all the etymologies, and nobody dared to come back the second class without having done all of their homework and research. So where I got started with medieval literature was really a fondness for etymologies and language, which is something that has always really intrigued me. And as I began reading Chaucer and fell in love, I wanted to know what came before that. And I was really curious about the beginnings of the English language as we know it. And so I took a course on Old English and then followed with a second course on Beowulf. And for those of you who know what the Old English, the Anglo-Saxon period, rough dates, any ideas? Let's say the literature starts predominantly around the 7th century, 8th century, not a whole lot of writing before that. And then goes until, what is the outside date? Anybody? 1066? Yeah. So the the typical date that's cited for the end of the Anglo-Saxon period. That's the Norman invasion. Anyway, so that's the period in which I work, and really began to love the literature. I never dreamed in a million years that I would make a career out of being an Anglo-Saxonist. There's a joke that we tell frequently in our circles, which is kind of old by now, that Old English as a language grammatically has no future tense. So the joke is that our mothers tell us, there's no future in Old English at all. Well, I proved my mom wrong, and I ended up going into this as an academic pursuit. I actually took 2 years off and went to Japan, and I wasn't really sure where I was going to go career-wise, and I found myself really missing academia, missing the intellectual environment of school, and I started to relate my own experiences as a foreigner living in a country where all the customs were really rather different to the experiences of a character who speaks, and it's called an elegy in Old English. It's rather different from what we know about elegies, but the poem The Wanderer, who is in exile and lordless, friendless, without family, and is wandering alone. And I kept coming back to that poem. And I think it's really what drove me to come back to study Old English full-time and medieval studies in general. And I ended up in grad school and had a wonderful experience there. And I got to learn about all the great things about medieval literature, including even the tactile experience of looking at a manuscript. The amazing thing that you face when you encounter a book that is so old, that it has hair and it has skin, and it's a fully tactile experience. And combined with my love of philology, the two seem to really play comfortably together for me. And so I guess from here I would say something about my research, and this is very informal and kind of, off the cuff, but what drove me, as I said before, was a love of language and manuscripts. And so my first book project that I started working on in grad school and then finished up when I came here was a book on a 10th century manuscript, or actually 11th century. The dating is a little unclear sometimes in Old English terms. But the Vercelli book, as it's known, is a collection of poems and sermons. And I got really interested in the sermons. And coming from a Jewish background, my parents were really surprised that I wanted to work on Catholic homilies. But as it turns out, it's the same skill set, right? You apply the same skills of exegesis to reading biblical texts. And that's something that I was very comfortable with, having come through a Hebrew academy and having studied Mishnah and Talmud and all of those things. So I felt right at home. Although I had to learn a whole lot about Catholicism, I didn't know much about it, or the Gospels for that matter. And I really, that book was a hardcore philological text involved in really just reading closely a single manuscript. And the manuscript, as it turned out, was located in Italy, so it was really, really nice to go and research there. And now I tell all my students, pick your research topic by what country you want to end up in. And it really works that way. So it's great that there are manuscripts all over the place that you can look at. And so mine was in Italy. I had a great time writing that book. And then lately, I've turned to a very, very different kind of project, something that brings together philology and an interest in form and poetry with cultural studies. And this brings out my Jewish background and the things that I learned in high school and through my whole life. And I was able to bring that to medieval studies. And what happened was I started to read a lot of medieval texts and found that they were really kind of gruesomely anti-Semitic, anti-Judaic. And I had always just accepted it as kind of par for the course. You just expect that there's going to be some negative attitudes about Jews in medieval texts. And the more I read, the more disturbed I became by how frequent it was, and the kinds of stereotypes that I encountered about Jews. So now I'm actually teaching a course on this subject. It's been a really fun course. It's called The Imaginary Jew, The Roots of Anti-Semitism in the Medieval Period, something like that. I can't remember the exact title. In Medieval Literature and Culture. And what fascinates me about it is that all the modern stereotypes that you hear about post-Nazi Germany really had their roots in the medieval period. So all the expressions that come out of kind of somatic ideas of what Jews look like, how they behave, all kinds of interesting theories about what Jews are made of and how they act. And of course, the really horrible stuff is this led to a series of massacres all over Europe, especially Western Europe, and crusades in which fighting abroad, so people were invited to kill the infidels in Jerusalem in the effort to recapture Jerusalem, but there was fallout at home. They figured, you can kill an infidel abroad, why not just kill them closer to home? And those were the Jews who suffered. And of course, the big thing, which is blood libels. So Jews were accused of slaughtering Christian children and sometimes using their blood for ritual purposes. One that you may have heard is that they used their blood for putting it in matzah on Passover. Very interesting kinds of stereotypes. And all of this led to a very difficult time for Jews in England. They came only in 1066, so after my period that I really work in terms of research, and they were forced to leave in 1290. It's a very short amount of time that Jews were actually permitted to live on English soil. And they weren't allowed back until 1656 under Cromwell. So a very short period of time that Jews were allowed to live there. Anyway, I had all of this going on, and I was extremely interested in this literature, and I thought, okay, so my research is about Anglo-Saxon stuff. Where do Jews fit in? And I was really surprised to learn that despite the fact that there were no Jews living at all in England that we can discover, that in fact they were quite obsessed with Jews. They wrote a lot about them. And the literature or the attitudes tend to fall into two categories. The one is a quite negative attitude towards contemporary Jews, or what they imagined to be contemporary Jews. They saw them as the killers of Christ, as willful negators of Christ and the Christian truth, and as blind. This is something that comes out of the Pauline epistles, as a blind people who are deaf to the word of the gospel, who are also deaf. I said blind and deaf to the word of the gospel. Thank you. Nobody corrected me there. And then on the other hand, there's this really positive attitude. And it comes out of a kind of fascination of the Jews as a prototypical nation, right? The idea of Israel as a nation, as the chosen people of God, and all these valorous characters like Moses and Abraham, right? Who really were the prototypes for the New Testament, for the new religion. And so they were able to maintain these two attitudes. And sort of, it became a great paradox in the literature that on the one hand, you would find these texts that were super, super positive. Moses becomes a Germanic hero. And on the other hand, these really negative and nasty kind of attitudes towards Jews. So I decided to pursue the path less taken, which is to say the really positive stuff. And my second book was about biblical poetry. That is poetry that was based on the Bible, but only loosely in many cases, and turned into heroic poetry. So what you find are this really odd combination of a kind of Germanic idiom, right, that is associated with Anglo-Saxon culture and especially Germanic heroic culture. And then on the other hand, this glorification of the patriarchs as real warriors and heroes. And the two come together in a very interesting way. And so I was interested in how that happens, in the mechanics of how these characters are turned into these heroes on the one hand, and then on the other as a kind of wider cultural appropriation of the English, of the idea of themselves as the new Israel. They proclaimed it all over the place, and it started in Bede's Ecclesiastical History in 731. Bede started to cultivate this idea that the English could be seen as the new Israel. After all, the Germanic tribes, when they had migrated to what we now call England, which was then just a bunch of different tribes living there, to this territory and conquered the Celtic people who were there, they saw themselves as kicking out the enemies and moving into a new Israel. And this became the Promised Land. And that idea, right, of seeing themselves as the chosen people permeates the literature, and especially this biblical poetry, so that they can own this idea of a kind of nationalistic glory. And in point of fact, one thing that I discovered through reading about theories of nationalism is that England is really seen today as one of the first countries to develop a kind of proto-nationalistic identity. Most of them came much later with state formation. But through this ideology, they were able to create this idea of themselves as a chosen people, and they saw themselves as united under a single God. So all of that is to set up the project that I pursued, and I brought for you today a little bit of poetry, and I thought it would be something that would be quite accessible. Everybody here knows Exodus to some extent? Okay, and do any of you guys go to Passover Seders? Okay, this is a great party trick because when you're reading the story of Exodus, I tried this once with a kind of mixed audience of, hardcore Jews and others who knew less about it, and I brought this poem and shared it at a Passover Seder, and people were really intrigued by it. And basically, what happens in the poem is two verses of Exodus. So this is your first sheet. 2 verses of Exodus are turned into something like 70 lines of Old English poetry. So you can already see the kind of embellishment that is brought to bear in the translation of this material. And so here are the lines in English. And Moses stretched forth his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its strength when the morning appeared. And the Egyptians fled against it, and the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. And the waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen, even all the host of Pharaoh that went in after them into the sea. There remained not so much as one of them. It's not so exciting, right? It's kind of a bare bones account of a wonderful miracle, right? Namely the parting of the Red Sea and how the Israelites were able to escape to their freedom, and then the waters came over the Egyptians and crushed them completely. And really, this is the way that it's told in Exodus 14. Any of you who are really familiar with the Exodus story will know that there's a far more exciting account of the same thing in Exodus 15. And it's a poetic account, and it's, has anyone, if you go to synagogue, you'll know this. Sorry to keep harping on the Jewish thing, but the Song of Moses, Az Yashir Moshe U'Vnei Israel. It's a song that you sing, every Sabbath, right? You sing this psalm. And that's precisely the text that appears in 15. And it's a far more exciting account of the crossing of the Red Sea. So you have prose, a very short prose and unexciting prose account on the one hand in 14, and then 15 is poetry, the same thing, retold. So you already have this kind of prosimetrum, right? This idea of poetry and prose coming together, which the Anglo-Saxons could capitalize on when they took this account and turned it into exciting poetry. So I think it's the same kind of rhythm that you're already seeing in the biblical book. And if you turn to your next page, you'll see a lot of funny writing. And it may look rather foreign to you. I'm interested in the part after the 3 little stars at the bottom of 103. And I should say that Old English literature has some differences in spelling that might trick you a little bit. So if you look at the like line 449, you'll see the second word, waron beorchlithu. You see that funny character? That's known as an F, and it makes a th sound. There are a couple of others. Let me see where I can find for you a thorn. Let's see. I'm not seeing any thorns right here. But in any case, what we can do is you can just follow along. I'm going to read a little snippet so you can hear what it sounds like, and try to deliver what I think will be a kind of spirited account of what this sounds like in true heroic form. And then we'll look at a translation together, and I think you'll see what I'm getting at when I say that this stuff is rather exciting and exhilarating. Okay, so to start out with, beginning at 447, Folk was a farid, flod eisa bequom gastus jombra, jeofon deatha hueop, waran beorchlithu, blood bestemid, hom hail fra spau, reum was on udum, water wapna full, walmist a star. Waron Egypta F on corta, flugan fortienda, fair on jetan. Woldon herre bleath a hamas findan, gulp wearth gnorndra, him ongen je nap, atol ude je welk, neither any bequom herjes to hama, ac behindan beleac word mit waya. There weas lagon, mere mod gode, maien was adrenched. Streamas, stodon, storm op je wat, hea to heavenum, herwop a mast. Lade kurmdon, luft op je swerk, fagem stavnum, flod, blood je wod. Rand birdie waren rovena, roder sweepoda, Merideatha mast, modius swoltan, kuningus on corthra, curus swithroda sas et enda, we bord chinon, hea over halathum, homwell asta, meristreum modi. Maien was on quelma, fasta je feterod, forthgangus way, searwam a salad, sand basnaran, witroda furta, hona wadam astreum, sinkel da sa, saltam udum, aflastam jewuna, eche stadolas, naked nudboda, neosan coma, fach fedegast, sethe feondum je neop, was seo hauna luft, hail fra je blanden, brim berstenda, blood eis an weop, sam an asith, othat soth method thur Moises hand, modia rumda, wida watha, wal fathmum sweop. Flod fam goda, fire krungan, lagu land je fail, luft was on herred, wikon well fastan, vegas burstan, multan meritoras, da se michtiga slow mid halliga hand, heovon richa swerd on verbeamus. I think that gives you a sense of how it goes. What you can probably tell already is that this is pretty far from Chaucer. Yeah, it's not really easily comprehensible to modern day English speakers. But this is the roots of our language. This is how English began. And the reason it may not sound too, maybe you can tell me, why is it so foreign? Can anyone guess? Because probably it's a purely Germanic language. Yeah, so a lot of what we're familiar with later on is a kind of infusion, especially of French, into the language, which happens after the Normans come in 1066. And so part of it, this is just part of it, but the language itself is very Germanic. So if you know German, you can pull out pieces here. A lot of the verbs are quite similar. The idea of compound forms, where you have two different morphemes put together. In German, you can have these long words that go on and on. You just keep adding more elements to it. The same kind of thing happens in Old English. The other thing that looks foreign to us is probably you can probably hear it. There's a lot of alliteration in the poetry. Did you guys catch that as I was reading? And really not so much rhyme, with the exception of flawed, blod, your word, which is such a great line. That's the only time where you really hear the rhyme coming through. And rhyme was a technique that they knew about, but didn't employ as a regular feature in their poetry. But alliteration was the mainstay of the line, and of course, syllable stress and various other things. But it's, if you do some training in it, it sort of comes, right? So German helps, or Norse, or any affiliated Germanic language will help you learn this. And so let's find out what we just said here. I gave you a translation that I really like from it's S.A.J. Bradley's collection of Old English poetry. And if you're interested in learning more about Old English poetry, I would go there. It's a beautiful anthology and very, very lovely translations. So can I enlist your help to maybe read a little bit out loud? And if you guys, could I start with you? And just pick, read as much as you like, a couple of sentences or until whatever you feel like, and then we'll pass it around in modern English just to hear what we read, yeah?
Okay. The people were panic-stricken. Horror of the flood came upon their miserable spirits. The deep menaced them with death. The mountainous screes were bedabbled with blood. The sea spewed gore. There was uproar amid the waves. The water was full of weapons, and the reek of carnage rose above. The Egyptians were thrown into retreat. Terrified, they fled. They had experienced a catastrophe.
The cowards wanted to get back to their homes. Their boasting had become more pessimistic. The terrible tumbling of the waves brought darkness upon them, and none of the army there came home, but Providence cut them off from behind by the flood. Where paths had previously lain, the ocean raged. The army was inundated, and cataracts appeared. The turbulence rose up high into the skies, a most mighty cry of despair from the army. The aggressors were shrieking. The air darkened above. With dying voices, blood infused the flood.
The shielding ramparts were rent apart. The mightiest death-dealing sea lashed the sky. Bold men perished, kings in their pomp. The sea's recession finally failed. High above the men the shields gleamed. The ocean rampart, moody swirl of the sea, towered aloft. Their might was trapped fast in them. Sand caused the swamping of the passage ahead, entangled with the accoutrements and of the army's road of attack and the swirling of the waters. The sea, ever chill with its salty waves, came from its defiant ways, seeking its wonted state, its eternal foundations, a naked pretender of distress, a hostile vagrant thing, which stranded the aggressors. The discolored air was mingled with blood.
The bursting ocean had menaced the voyage of the seafarers with horror of a gory death, until the true ordaining Lord, by the hand of Moses, gave spaces to its fury. Widely it coursed and scoured with its fatal clutches. The flood foamed, men fell dying, the water encroached upon the land, the air was agitated.
The remaining walls gave way, the ramparts burst, the bastions of the sea dissolved. With his holy hand, the mighty one, guardian Lord of the heavenly kingdom, struck the bulwarks of the ocean. They could not hinder those haughty people, the course of the saving waters, the sea's fury, but he destroyed their multitudes with a shrieking terror.
The ocean grew enraged, drew itself up, and slid upon them. Appalling fears arose. Mortal wounds oozed. The handiwork of God, the foamy bosomed sea, fell from high in the heavens upon the route of attack. The guardian lord of the ocean flood struck the unavailing rampart with an ancient sword, so that by that death blow legions perished, the horde of the sinful.
Excellent.
Completely surrounded, they lost their souls, that army white with terror of deluge, when they bowed to the pent-up mass of dark water, a most enormous and violent wave. Their whole force perished when the hosts of the Egyptians were drowned, Pharaoh along with his people.
God's adversary quickly found, when he sank into the abyss, that the guardian lord of the ocean was the greater in might, wrathful and terrible, He had meant to determine the battle by the power of the sword. Overwhelming was the reward assigned to the Egyptians for that day's work, for of that quite unfathomable army none came back home as a survivor, so that he might tell their fate and proclaim through the cities the greatest evil tidings. The fall of their lords to those men's wives, but death at sea swallowed up those battalions, and the tale-tellers likewise. He who possessed the power voided the boast of those men. They had been contending against God.
Fabulous. Yeah, so really quite an expansion, right, from the two verses in the Bible. And there's probably a lot that you can notice that's happening here in the way of embellishment. So, for example, how would you categorize God in this poem from what we've read?
As something to be feared.
Yeah. Feared, it's that the typical view of the Old Testament God is a wrathful God. Yeah, so that's part of it. What else? Does he remind you of any other kinds of characters that you know from ancient texts? Yeah.
And there's a Poseidon,
Yes.
yeah, with the guardian lord of the oceans, the greater in might.
Yeah, exactly. And what I think they're able to derive from it, so where they get this idea of this God as a kind of Poseidon figure is both, of course, the heroic ethos, right? It's much more appropriate to have a God who is an active God in control of the elements who which sort of bow and turn at every whim of the divinity. But also in Exodus 15, you get this description of God separating the waters with the single blow of his nostrils, right? So that the wind that comes out of his nostrils just splits the waters, and so there's almost a heroic element already built into Exodus 15, which may have been transported back into this discussion. So yeah, he's more like Poseidon here, and a wrathful God, a God who is really down to earth in the sense that he's in the midst of the fray. Yeah, very, very different from the removed God who hangs out, if you remember in Exodus, he appears in cloud cover by day, and a fiery pillar by night. So as symbols, as elements, things that are kind of abstract, yeah? And here, this God is down to earth, involved, moving the elements around. And it's not just God who is at work here. There's something else. What do you get out of the descriptions of nature here? How is nature behaving? Roguishly, right? Right, kind of, the elements have their own minds. I don't know if you caught that, but they have moods. The elements are hostile. They intend things. They rise up. The bursting ocean had menaced the voyage of the seafarers with horror of a gory death. This is in 478. As if by its own will, right? The elements are responding, and all of this is to form the walls of the ocean, which become like towers. So there's also a kind of a willingness to see this divine plan through which nature is operating in terms of civilization and architecture, right? Things that are familiar to the human world. So all of this makes for a really interesting recasting of what is a rather straightforward narrative in the Bible. And what you're not seeing here is Moses. I didn't pick a passage with Moses in it, but you could see in the lines that just follow, thereupon Moses, the man of high virtue with divine utterance, declared to the Israelites on the seashore enduring precepts and a profound message. And that doesn't really communicate all of the language that describes him as a kind of almost like a warrior figure, almost cast in the model of an Aeneas, right? Much more than the Moses that we know from the Bible, who had a problem speaking in public, right? And his brother Aaron had to speak for him. This guy is really powerful and assertive. And it makes for a very different kind of reading of the biblical story. So you can probably see why I was fascinated with this stuff, right? In the book, I look at this poem and a poem about Daniel, the book of Daniel, who is a dream interpreter. And then in the end, I end up with the story of Judith, who is not traditionally part of the Hebrew canon, but was treated as such in the Middle Ages. And yeah, I guess on that note, I should invite you guys to ask questions and see what you guys think of it. Anybody want to go first? I can't see the clock, so I'm trusting that Masha's departure meant that it's time to go to questions.
Perhaps you've already addressed this a little bit, but I'm just curious what makes the interpretation of Exodus more valuable, or the original text more succinct. Is it the embellishment of details? Is it the way that language is used in general, and maybe the vocabulary and the breadth of it?
A little bit of everything, I would say, and a willingness to see the passing of the Egyptians, right, or of the Israelites through, and the crushing of the Egyptians as a kind of battle, right, which it's not in the biblical text. The Israelites in the Old English poem are armed, right? They're fierce warriors. Not so in the biblical text. So there's a kind of desire to transport it into a known heroic context, and Exodus just seems to work in that context because this is the major story of redemption of the Israelite people. Right? So this is the story that is recited on Passover because it's a redemption story. And so from that perspective, I think it both fits in with the Christian ethos of redemption, and on the other hand, lends itself well to this kind of embellished narrative. And of course, there's an attraction to all the cool language and the infusing of the elements with anthropomorphic characterization. But yeah, I think Exodus in particular lends itself to that because of the kind of prominence of that narrative within the biblical history itself. Good question, yeah.
I just have a question about the languages you've studied.
Yeah.
So did you know Hebrew already from your high school, and then you studied Old English?
Yeah, yeah.
Are there other languages that you use or that you need to know for the type of work?
Yeah, I mean, lots of different. So Latin is a big one, because a lot of Old English poetry is actually derived from Latin precursors. And a lot of the ideas that they have about Jews, for example, comes through, since there were no Jews living there, right? It either came from their imagination completely or from the church fathers, who had written extensively on the subject of Jews and had lots of different impressions about anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. And then, of course, there's a whole fraught history of Jews in the world since the time of Christ. So, yeah, the Hebrew came first. I studied it my whole life pretty much, and haven't used it in more years than I care to remember. So it's probably rusty by now. But I started there, and then when I encountered medieval literature, I guess the most important languages I use are Latin and German, and of course you need to know French, and so there's a whole bunch of other languages, but for my period the big ones are Latin and German. Yeah.
I was wondering if you have any sense of how a Jewish person living during this time would react to this type of poem.
Yeah.
Because you said these were Christians writing.
Yes, yeah. So, yeah, so in this period there weren't Jews living in England. However, we do have, if you look to the post-conquest period in England, so we're just talking about England at the moment, it's interesting to see Jewish responses, and you can gauge them in a variety of different ways. Jews do write back to the tradition, and it's sort of like the Empire Strikes Back, but they strike back, and they write all different kinds of things. The most bizarre response that I've ever seen in the form of a Jewish text is a rewriting of the Gospels, and it's called Toledot Yeshu, for those of you who know Hebrew will understand that this is generations of Jesus. And it is a whole rewriting of the Gospels, and it is incredibly irreverent. Mary is a hairdresser. She gets knocked up by Joseph, who wasn't supposed to be her suitor, and Jesus gets hanged on a celery stalk. And then pinned up afterwards. And it's a response, right? It's a response that's fighting back to the idea that the central reason for Jewish hatred tends to have gotten started with the idea of the crucifixion, that the Jews are responsible for killing the Savior. And so this is one way of responding. There are also more academic texts where they respond to this long tradition of, it's called adversus Judaeos text, against Jews. And basically it's theologians who write texts in which they imagine two interlocutors, a Jew and a Christian. And the Jew always comes off as a little stupid, who tries to say things like, well, if Christ was so strong, why didn't he just pick himself up off the cross and save himself, right? And so then the Christian character responds and says, well, that's a foolish way of thinking, blah, blah, blah. So there are texts that challenge that and use that same genre but reverse it. And so you have the Jew who is the one that is empowered and smart and full of wisdom, and the Christian who gets it wrong. So there's a big tradition of that stuff too, and it's fascinating. So we do have a sense of what they thought, encountering maybe not this text per se, but writings about Jews in a whole variety of contexts.
Yeah, because it's not necessarily a negative account or a poem, but
right.
By associating it with Greek mythology or that sort of mythological ethos,
yeah.
I assume that it would be a little bit offensive. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, in the sense that I guess any rewriting of the Bible is dangerous, and the Christians more than any, I mean, they were fundamentally aware of this fact. And that's one of the things that I talk about in my book. I was so fascinated by, because if you read the Fathers and people like Jerome, who translated the Bible into Latin and was so nervous about getting it right that he actually went back to the Hebrew original and the Greek texts, that were available, and then retranslated because he was unsatisfied with the translation of the Bible that was available. And he was very nervous about getting it right. I mean, really honoring the Word of God, and that it should be at least in spirit, right? I mean, you can't always, there's no such thing as a seamless translation from one language to another. There's always idiomatic gaps. But he wanted to make sure that his text was as authentic and authoritative as possible. And that attitude towards the Bible continued all the way up. I mean, you can see that in any biblical translation, the Wycliffe Bible, all of the big, the James Bible, right? Everything, and yet something like this is permitted to exist, and that really struck me as amazing. And I thought, how does that happen? Where on the one hand, there's this fear of getting it wrong, of mistranslating, and yet then there's something like this. So it must serve an altogether different purpose. It's not seen as a didactic text, not something where you would go to learn your Bible, but rather a genre in which it is assumed that you know your Bible and you can then appropriate the whole thing into your own culture.
So biblical fan fiction?
Yeah, I love it. That's a great way to put it. Totally, yeah. And those in the know, they would understand the discrepancies, but celebrate them, right? In the sense that they could see their own leaders as new Moseses and new Abrahams, and their own culture as getting it right, being the chosen people, accepting the new covenant of God. And for some reason, this poetry just escapes this poetry and Latin poetry like it beforehand, because there's a whole series, a whole tradition of Latin writing, especially 4th to the 6th century, where they took biblical poems and made them into epics and really used a lot of Virgil, right? So that they are true epics in the sense of both scale and in terms of the language that's used in the meter. And all of that just sort of escaped this kind of scathing eye of the theologian, who would normally be very nervous about such an endeavor. Yeah, so that's another reason why it's so much fun to read. It's like free from all the, all of the restrictions that you'd normally find. Yeah. Other questions?
Can I just say, I mean, it's like an action movie. It's like a blockbuster.
Yeah.
And I'm struck by how much emphasis there is on the suffering of
Yeah.
the Egyptians.
Yeah.
Which is kind of, and it's like you're almost meant to start feeling sorry for them, but then you get a word like the sinful, and that sort of reminds you that they're not the good guys here.
That's right.
But that's, I mean, there's a lot of terror and screaming and despair.
Yeah, yeah. And another thing that gets picked up on a lot by scholars is this very interesting language of who has the right to the homeland. So that homeland is often associated with Jews in these texts, and the Egyptians are kind of trespassers on that idea. They're the ones who inhibit them from finding their homeland, and the Israelites are often associated with sailors. I guess because one reason it's been theorized before is that they were seeing this as a kind of analog for their own migration, to what we now call England from the Germanic territories, and that's one way to think of it. Especially in the passages where they're described as sailors moving through the split waters, when of course they're not sailing, right? That the whole point is that it's dry land. But it's a metaphor that works for them in this adaptation.
So would the Egyptians have been associated in their mind with a specific group?
That's a great question. Yeah, we often wonder and love to think that maybe the Egyptians are the Vikings or any other people that have encumbered this vision and this idea of nation. The problem we have is that of dating, right? When do we know when this stuff was finalized and fossilized in its current written form. Most Old English poetic manuscripts date to around the year 1000. Beowulf also. But they all had, probably oral pre-lives. So it's hard to say when this poem was constructed. And a lot of people have tried to work out, well, if it's, after 793, which is the big attack by the Vikings on Lindisfarne, then it could be that we could see this as an allegory. And so you get into this discussion of dating versus literary evidence. And it's very difficult to know with any Old English poem when it can be dated, although some people would disagree with me who are very staunch daters. But yeah, I mean, that's a really intriguing question, and one that I've thought a lot about. Are the Jews representative of a kind of, anti-force against the current day Vikings? And is this a way of talking about the problems that they're having? Because there aren't that many poems that actually talk about Viking attacks, which is surprising. So it feels like it could be a way of coding all of that. Just not enough evidence to make that claim.
Thank you, Sam. That was wonderful.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, guys.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.